Hey, everybody, welcome back. We're taking a deep dive today into how our minds work.
It's going to be fun.
It is going to be fun. It's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Yes.
Um, and just to kind of set the stage for everybody, uh, you know, we're always making decisions every single day. And this is really going to help unpack why we make the decisions that we do.
Yeah, and one of the really cool things that Kahneman does is that he sort of introduces us to like the main characters of the book right off the bat.
Yeah.
And he calls them System 1 and System 2.
Okay, so we have two systems battling it out
Uh-huh.
up there.
Exactly.
Okay, so tell me more about these systems.
So System 1 is like your autopilot, right?
Right.
It's fast, it's intuitive, it's emotional. It's what makes you swerve if you see something coming at your car or you recognize a friend across the street.
Got it. So very efficient.
Very efficient, but it can lead to some errors too, especially when you're dealing with things that are more complex.
Oh, I see.
So that's where System 2 comes in.
Okay.
That's more deliberate, more logical. That's what you're using when you're like solving a math problem or, planning a vacation.
Yeah, planning a vacation. Something that requires a little bit more thought.
Right. So these two systems are constantly interacting.
Yes.
Okay. So how do they work together? I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm making impulsive decisions and other times, I'm really thinking things through.
Well, so Kahneman says that System 1 is like constantly generating suggestions for System 2, like impressions and feelings and intuitions.
Okay.
And then System 2 can either go with it or it can say, hold on a second, I'm going to step in and override that.
Okay.
But the thing is, System 2 is kind of lazy.
So it wants to just go with the flow.
Yeah, and unless it sees like a real reason to intervene, it's going to just kind of, be like, yeah, sure, System 1, whatever you say.
Oh, well.
And a good example of this is something that he calls the bat and ball problem.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So he poses this question. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 together.
Okay.
The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
Okay, so if the bat costs $1 more and the total is $1.10, I'm going to say the ball costs 10 cents. That's what most people say.
Okay.
But it's actually wrong.
Oh, really?
If you engage System 2 and do the math,
Okay.
the ball actually costs 5 cents.
Wow. You're right. I totally fell for that.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect example of how our intuition can lead us astray.
Yes, and this is a theme that you're going to see throughout the book is like we need to be aware of these cognitive biases
Okay.
and engage System 2.
Got it. So he goes beyond just explaining these two systems.
Yes.
He talks about how they influence our perceptions and our judgments.
Exactly. So you can't talk about System 1 without talking about priming.
Priming.
So priming is basically like when exposure to one thing influences how you react to something else, even if you're not aware of the connection.
Okay, that's interesting. Could you give me an example?
Yeah, so imagine if you're reading a list of words and they're all associated with old age.
Okay, like wrinkles.
Yeah, wrinkles, gray,
Florida.
Florida.
Okay.
And then afterwards, someone asks you to walk down a hallway. Studies have shown that people who were primed with those words will walk slower than those who weren't.
That's fascinating. So it's like our brains are making these associations without us even realizing it.
Yes.
And that's affecting our behavior.
Exactly. It's like the stereotype is kind of activated in your mind.
Wow. So our brains are constantly making these unconscious connections.
They are. And this is just one example of how System 1 is always at work.
Okay. So what else does Kahneman dive into?
Well, so kind of related to priming is this idea of cognitive ease.
Cognitive ease.
Which basically means our brains love things that are easy to process, like things that are familiar, easy to understand, visually appealing.
So our brains are like couch potatoes.
Yeah, exactly.
They want to stay comfy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the thing is, like, the easier something is to process, the more true it feels to us.
Really? Even if it isn't true?
Even if it isn't true.
So like if something rhymes, it's more believable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things that are repeated often or presented clearly, those things are going to feel more true to us, even if they're not.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
So this is why it's so important to really think critically about the information that's coming at us.
Yes, especially today when we're just bombarded with information from all sides.
Right.
We can't just go with our gut feeling or what feels familiar.
Okay. So Kahneman doesn't just stop there, though, right? He
Yeah.
keeps going.
He does. He does. So another bias that he introduces is the halo effect.
The halo effect.
Which is how our overall impression of someone or something can influence how we judge their specific traits.
So it's like if you meet someone and you think they're attractive, you automatically assume they're also intelligent and kind.
Exactly.
Even if you don't know them that well.
Exactly. And it can work the opposite way, too. If you have a negative first impression,
Oh.
you're more likely to view their other qualities negatively.
It's like our brain is creating this halo or a shadow
Yes,
based on that first impression.
exactly. And it colors how we see them.
That's incredible. It's like we're always seeing the world through these like tinted lenses. It's so fascinating how much our unconscious biases are shaping our perceptions.
Yes. And Kahneman argues that just being aware of these biases is the first step towards like mitigating their influence.
Okay.
Like if we understand how our minds work, we can start to make more objective judgments.
So it's all about self-awareness.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about system 1 and system 2 and how our brains kind of jump to conclusions and make these snap judgments.
Yes.
But I'm curious to hear more about how these systems influence our decisions, like when it comes to risk and reward.
Well, that's where prospect theory comes in.
Okay, prospect theory. I like it. Tell me more.
So this is actually what won him the Nobel Prize in economics.
Wow.
And it kind of challenges how we think about traditional economic theory and how people make decisions.
Oh, okay.
So prospect theory is about how people evaluate potential gains and losses.
Okay.
And it says that we're not always these like rational actors who are just trying to maximize our outcomes.
Nice.
Our choices are really influenced by how we frame things
Oh, interesting.
and how we feel about the risks involved.
Yeah. So emotions play a big role.
Huge role.
Yeah.
Even when we think we're being totally logical.
Wow.
And so one of the key concepts in prospect theory is loss aversion,
Loss aversion.
which basically means that the pain of a loss is felt much more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Okay, so like losing $100 feels way worse than the joy of finding $100.
Exactly.
Right.
And this can explain why people are so reluctant to sell stocks that have gone down in value,
Right.
even if it makes sense financially to do so.
Because they don't want to experience that loss.
Right. They're so focused on avoiding that loss that they hold on hoping it'll go back up.
So we're more motivated to avoid pain than pursue pleasure.
It seems that way.
So our brains are wired to be pessimists.
You could say that.
Interesting.
Huh.
So how can we overcome this loss aversion?
Well, one thing is just to be aware of it.
Okay.
Right? When you're making a decision, ask yourself, am I being influenced by this fear of loss?
Right.
Try to step back and really look at the situation objectively.
Got it. But Kahneman doesn't stop there, right? He digs even deeper into how our emotions impact decisions.
He does. He goes on to explore framing effects.
Framing effects.
Yeah, so this is about how the way information is presented can totally change our choices.
It's like the power of marketing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
So
right.
for example, imagine you're told about a medical treatment that has a 90% survival rate.
Okay, that sounds good.
Right. But what if they told you it had a 10% mortality rate?
Oh, that sounds scary.
Right. It's the same information,
Yeah.
but the framing is totally different.
Totally.
And it evokes a completely different emotional response.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Like when you see something that's 50% off versus buy one, get one free.
Exactly.
It's the same thing, but
It feels different.
yeah, it feels different.
So this shows how our system 1 is so influenced by like emotional cues and how things are worded.
Wow. So we really have to be mindful of the language that's being used and how it can influence our choices.
Yes, we can't just take things at face value.
Yeah.
We have to really pay attention to how information is presented and try to see beyond that.
That's so important, especially in today's world.
It is.
So beyond just pointing out these biases, does Kahneman offer ways to overcome them?
He does. He suggests we can use system 2 to kind of override them
Okay.
and make more rational choices, but he acknowledges this is not always easy.
Right, because system 2 is a little lazy.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we motivate our lazy system 2?
Well, one way is to make the deliberative process easier and more appealing.
Okay, I like that. How do we do that?
So like if you're trying to make a complex decision, break it down into smaller steps.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah. And another strategy is to like pre-commit to a course of action.
Okay.
So like if you know you're prone to impulsive spending,
Right.
you can set up automatic transfers to your savings account.
So you're not tempted to spend it.
Yeah.
So it's like we're setting up guardrails for ourselves
Exactly.
to prevent our system 1 from, taking over.
Yeah. Yeah. And this idea of pre-commitment kind of leads into his exploration of mental accounting.
Mental accounting. What is that?
So it's about how we mentally categorize our money
Okay.
and how that affects our spending habits.
Interesting.
So like imagine you find a $20 bill on the street. What are you going to do with it?
I'd probably spend it on something fun,
Yeah,
like go buy a latte or something.
exactly. But what if instead of finding it, you earned that $20 by working an extra hour?
Oh, I'd probably save it or put it towards a bill.
Exactly.
Ooh.
Wow, that's mental accounting.
So we treat money differently depending on where it came from.
Yes, even though it's all just money.
Right.
So this can help us understand why we make irrational financial decisions sometimes.
Okay, so like if we get a bonus at work, we might be more likely to splurge on something?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I get it.
Or if we frame something as a gift to ourselves, even if we're taking it from our savings.
Right. It all comes down to how we frame it in our mind.
Yes.
Interesting. So Kahneman doesn't just focus on finances, right? He applies this to other areas of life.
Yes. He talks about how our perceptions of happiness and well-being are also influenced by these biases and mental shortcuts.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear more about this.
Yeah.
How does he define happiness?
Well, he talks about two types of happiness. Experienced happiness, which is how we feel in the moment,
Okay.
and remembered happiness, which is how we evaluate past experiences.
So it's like the difference between living in the present and reflecting on the past.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that those two don't always line up.
Right.
You might have an experience that's unpleasant in the moment, but you look back on it fondly
Oh, yeah.
because of how it ended or the meaning you attached to it.
That's true. It's like we romanticize some of our struggles,
Yeah,
even though they were hard at the time.
exactly.
Interesting.
And Kahneman says that this difference between experienced and remembered happiness can actually affect our decisions.
How so?
We make choices based on how we think we'll remember an experience
Right.
rather than how we're actually experiencing it.
Wow, so we might be missing out on the present moment because we're too focused on the future memory of it.
Exactly. And that's one of the big questions that he kind of leaves us with is like, how do we find that balance
Right, right.
between maximizing our present moment happiness and also creating these lasting memories?
That's a great question.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about how System 1 can kind of lead us astray.
Yeah.
But Kahneman doesn't just focus on like the negatives. He also talks about how the system can be super useful.
Oh, okay. So it's not always a bad thing.
Not at all. I mean, it's essential for like everyday life. Imagine trying to cross a busy street.
Right.
You don't have time to like stop and calculate the speed of every car.
Yeah.
You need System 1 to just react quickly.
Right. You need to make a decision in like a split second.
Exactly. And Kahneman points out that experts in all sorts of fields, from firefighters to chess players,
Right.
they rely on intuition to make quick judgments.
Interesting.
They've developed like a deep understanding of their field through years of experience. So System 1 can actually generate really accurate assessments in real time.
So intuition can almost be like a superpower then.
It can be. But, even experts can fall prey to those biases that we talked about.
Right.
So that's why Kahneman says it's so important to understand how our minds work, both the strengths and the limitations.
Right. Okay. So it's about finding that balance
Yeah,
between trusting our gut and, really thinking things through carefully.
exactly. Now, I'm curious about how these two systems influence our decisions, especially when it comes to things like risk and reward. Well, that's where his work on prospect theory comes in.
Okay. Prospect theory. Tell me more.
So this is the research that actually won him the Nobel Prize in economics.
Wow.
And it really challenges some of the fundamental assumptions about how people make decisions.
Interesting.
So it describes how people evaluate potential gains and losses.
Okay.
And it suggests that we're not always rational.
Right
We
on.
don't always make decisions based on just maximizing our expected outcomes.
Got it.
It's more nuanced than that. Our choices are influenced by how we frame those outcomes and how we feel about the risks involved.
So emotions play a role even when we think we're being completely logical.
Exactly. Emotions play a huge role. And, one of the key concepts here is this idea of loss aversion.
Loss aversion.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of that?
I think so.
So basically, people feel the pain of a loss much more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Like losing $100 feels way worse than finding $100.
Exactly. And this can explain a lot of our behavior.
Oh, I bet. Like why we're so hesitant to sell stocks when they're down.
Exactly, because we don't want to lock in that loss.
Right.
We're so focused on avoiding that pain that we just kind of hold on, hoping it will go back up.
So it's almost like we're more motivated to avoid pain than to pursue pleasure.
Yeah, it seems like that sometimes.
Wow. So are our brains just wired to be like pessimistic?
You could say that. It's like this negativity bias
Wow.
that can really affect our lives.
Okay, so how do we overcome this
Yeah.
loss aversion?
Well, one strategy is just being aware of it.
Okay.
Like when you're facing a decision, ask yourself, am I being overly influenced by this fear of loss?
Right.
Try to step back and see things objectively.
Okay. That's a good tip. I like that. But Kahneman doesn't stop there, does he?
No, he doesn't. He goes on to talk about framing effects.
Framing effects.
So this is about how the way information is presented can influence our choices.
Okay, it sounds like we're talking about marketing again.
Yeah, it's like the power of spin.
Right.
So imagine you're told about a medical treatment that has a 90% survival rate.
Okay, that sounds pretty good.
Right. But what if they told you it had a 10% mortality rate?
Oh, that doesn't sound so good.
It's the same information,
Right.
but the framing is totally different.
Yeah, it creates a totally different feeling.
Exactly, and it evokes a different emotional response.
So we really need to be critical thinkers then.
They do. We can't just take things at face value.
Right.
We have to look at how the information is presented.
Got it.
And try to see beyond that framing.
And that's really hard to do sometimes, especially, with everything that's coming at us.
It is. It is.
So beyond just pointing out these framing effects,
Yeah.
does Kahneman offer any solutions? Like how to overcome this?
He does. He suggests that we can use system 2 to override these biases,
Right.
and make more rational choices. But he acknowledges that it's not always easy.
Right, because System 2 is lazy.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we motivate System 2 to do its job?
Well, one way is to make the thinking process easier
Okay,
and more appealing.
I like that.
So if you're facing a complex decision, try breaking it down into smaller steps,
Oh, that's a good tip.
right? So it's less overwhelming.
Yeah,
And another strategy is to pre-commit to a course of action.
okay.
So for example, if you know you tend to overspend,
Right.
you can set up automatic transfers to your savings account.
So you're not even tempted to spend the money.
Exactly.
So it's like we're setting up those guardrails for ourselves again.
Yes.
So we don't go off track.
Right. And this idea of pre-commitment actually ties into his discussion of mental accounting.
Mental accounting. What is that?
So it's about how we mentally frame and categorize our money
Right.
and how that affects our spending.
Interesting.
So imagine you find a $20 bill on the street. What would you do with it?
I don't know. Probably go buy myself lunch or something fun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if you earned that $20 by working an extra hour?
I'd probably be more responsible with it.
Right. You probably wouldn't just spend it on a whim.
Yeah. I'd probably put it in my savings account or something.
Exactly. That's mental accounting at work.
So we treat money differently depending on where it came from.
Yeah, even though it's all just money.
That's so interesting.
And this can explain why we sometimes make irrational financial decisions.
Right. So like we're more likely to spend money that we win at a casino.
Yeah, or if we get a bonus at work, we might be more likely to splurge.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because we don't think of it the same way as our regular paycheck.
right. And we might be more willing to spend money on a vacation if we frame it as a gift to ourselves.
Even though it's coming from the same place.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. So it's all about how we frame it in our minds.
It is, and this mental accounting concept can really help us understand our spending habits.
It seems like Kahneman doesn't just stop at finances, though, right? He
Wow.
applies these ideas to other areas, too.
He does. He talks about how our perceptions of happiness and well-being are also shaped by these biases and mental shortcuts.
Okay, so let's talk about happiness. How does Kahneman define it?
Well, he distinguishes between two types of happiness. Experienced happiness,
Okay,
which is how we feel in the moment,
okay.
and remembered happiness,
Right.
which is how we evaluate past experiences.
So it's like the difference between living in the now and reflecting on the past.
Exactly.
Got it.
And what's interesting is that these two types of happiness don't always match up.
Oh, okay.
Like you might have an experience that's unpleasant in the moment, but you look back on it fondly.
Right, because maybe something good came out of it. Or...
Yeah, or you learn something from it.
Exactly.
And Kahneman argues that this discrepancy can actually affect our decisions.
Okay, how so?
We often make choices based on how we think we'll remember an experience rather than how we're actually experiencing it in the moment.
So we're almost trying to create memories
We are.
instead of actually living in the present.
Exactly. And that's one of the big questions that Kahneman kind of leaves us with is, how do we find that balance
Right.
between maximizing present moment happiness and creating lasting positive memories?
That's a great question. Okay, so we've been talking about all these biases and all these, shortcuts that our brains take.
Yeah.
But what do we do with all this information?
Well, one of the big things that Kahneman talks about is choice architecture.
Choice architecture.
Yeah.
What is that?
So it's this idea that we can design environments that actually nudge people towards better choices,
Okay.
even if they're relying on that system one thinking.
That's interesting. So like what?
So imagine you're trying to get people to eat healthier at a cafeteria.
Okay.
Instead of lecturing them about nutrition, you could rearrange the food displays
Okay.
so that the healthier options are more prominent and appealing.
Oh, so you're making it easier to choose the healthy option
Exactly.
without forcing people to do it.
Right. You're not taking away their choice,
Right.
but you're making the healthy choice the easier, more intuitive option.
I like that. And this can be applied to other areas too.
Oh, absolutely. It applies to everything from saving for retirement to making more sustainable choices.
Oh, wow. So give me an example.
Like automatically enrolling employees in a retirement savings plan
Oh, yeah.
with the option to opt out.
Right.
That can dramatically increase participation rates.
Wow.
People are still free to choose,
Right.
but the default is the beneficial one.
Right. So it's like setting up a good default setting for people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it goes back to this idea of understanding the limitations of our thinking. We can't always rely on willpower to make the best decisions.
Yeah.
So we need to create environments that actually support good decision-making,
Right.
even when we're not being totally rational.
So it's about being proactive
Yeah.
and setting ourselves up for success.
Exactly.
But beyond choice architecture, does Kahneman give any other advice?
Well, he also stresses the importance of slowing down
Okay.
engaging system too.
Okay. Easier said than done, though, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you can train yourself to be more aware of when you're about to make an impulsive decision.
How do we do that?
Just ask yourself, why am I making this decision?
Oh, okay.
Am I being swayed by emotions or biases? Or am I really thinking this through carefully?
So it's about taking a moment to pause
Exactly.
before we react.
Yeah, and another tip is to seek out diverse perspectives.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's easy to get stuck in our echo chambers,
Right.
surrounded by people who agree with us,
Yeah.
but hearing different viewpoints can help us challenge our assumptions.
Right. It helps us grow. So it's all about being open-minded.
It is. And lastly, remember that we're all going to make mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
No one is immune to these biases, even
Right.
people who study them for a living.
Right.
The key is to be forgiving of yourself and see those mistakes as opportunities to learn.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about progress.
Exactly.
You know what I really love about this book is that it's not just about, the negatives of our thinking.
Yeah,
It's also about the incredible power of our minds
it is.
and our ability to learn and grow.
Absolutely.
Well, I think this has been a really insightful deep dive.
Me too.
I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners have too.
I hope so.
Thinking Fast and Slow is such a valuable book.
It is.
It gives us these tools to understand ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, pick up a copy, and you might be surprised by what you learn.
Yeah, you might discover something new about yourself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Thinking Fast and Slow.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those minds engaged.